The purpose of this video is to provide biblical evidence that there is error that exists in the biblical timeline of history. We use this means in compliance with what Ebible Fellowship has advocated when an error is discovered.
Go to the Bible, and show us exactly where the error is, that you think we've committed. We can then check it out, and see if you have a point, or not. Chris McCann.
If an error is shown to exist in the biblical timeline, it would render dates inaccurate, from creation, to the flood, to the Great Tribulation and the end of the Church Age. It would invalidate May 21, 2011 Judgment Day, evidence of the world ending in 2033, and any other doctrine that is tied to the biblical timeline. This is no small matter. It is our hope that all Bereans who hold the Word of God in esteem will be interested in hearing out this matter, and checking the Bible to see if it is so. Harold Camping laid out the biblical timeline of history in his book Adam When. This video will examine a critical component of this timeline, which Mr. Camping requires to obtain what he refers to as the time bridge. The time bridge is determined by the age of Levi when he entered Egypt. This age is an essential piece of information required for Mr. Camping to correlate various time notices in the Bible that refer to the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt. Mr. Camping has constructed his biblical timeline on the assumption that Jacob was in Haran for 40 years. If Jacob was not in Haran for 40 years, the biblical timeline of history is in error. Mr. Camping begins his search on page 49 of Adam When. From this point all page references will be for the book Adam When, for this time bridge. He outlines some conclusions he has drawn from the Bible.
We do know that Levi's younger brother Joseph was probably 39 when Jacob was 130, because Joseph was 30 when he was made ruler over Egypt, Genesis 41:46. And it was during the second year of the famine or 9 years later, that he revealed himself to his brothers, Genesis 45:6. Thus, we know that Jacob was 91 years of age when Joseph was born. 130 minus 39 equals 91.
The question Mr. Camping asks is:
can we now discover how much younger Joseph was than Levi? The solution to this question depends on whether Jacob spent 20 years or 40 years in Haran with Uncle Laban. If he spent 20 years, the time sequence would work out something like this. Jacob worked 7 years for Rachel, Genesis 29:20. Deceived into marriage with Laban's older daughter Leah, Jacob was forced to serve another 7 years for Rachel, whom he apparently married at the beginning of this second 7 years, Genesis 29:30. Since Jacob worked 6 years for the flocks he received from Laban, Genesis 31:41, and these 6 years followed the birth of Joseph, Genesis 30:24, all of Jacob's children, with the exception of Benjamin, must have been born during the period that he worked the second 7 years, which was for Rachel. With Levi being the third son and Joseph the last born during this period, Levi must have been at least 4 years older than Joseph.
Mr. Camping determines.
For a number of reasons this conclusion appears untenable.
This video will examine each supposition that Mr. Camping has outlined in Adam When, in which he postulates that Jacob could not have been in Haran for 20 years and instead was in Haran for 40 years. We will show from the Bible that Mr. Camping's conclusion is erroneous and that Jacob was in fact in Haran for 20 years. On page 49, Mr. Camping makes this assertion.
If we assume Jacob spent only 20 years in Haran, he must have been about 84, or 85, when Reuben, his first son, was born. Although this is possible, it seems a bit difficult to believe.
Mr. Camping gives the example of Abraham at age 86, being concerned about being childless at his advanced age, and that this is the reason he fathered Ishmael by the Egyptian maid. However, when Abraham was 86, and childless, his concern, as recorded in the Bible, was not his advanced age, but rather Sarah's barrenness. Genesis 16:1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. Genesis 16:2. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Therefore, there is no biblical ground to suggest that Jacob was too old, at age 84, to have his first son. Mr. Camping makes this assertion on page 50.
12 children, born to Jacob during the second 7-year period, while he was working to pay for Rachel, seems quite impossible.
The Lord God in fact blessed Jacob with offspring in accordance with his plan, and Jacob's father Isaac's blessing upon him. Genesis 28:3. And God Almighty bless thee and make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a multitude of people. God was in control of multiplying Jacob. He permitted him to acquire 4 wives. He caused Leah to be fertile, and allowed Rachel to be barren for a period of time. He caused all 4 wives to bear sons, and these sons would go on to bear sons. Thus God was fulfilling his promise to Abraham. One of the ways God caused many children to be born within 7 years was through the event of twin births. The language of the Bible reveals the likelihood of 2 sets of twins being born within this 7-year period. The Bible's use of the words conceived, H 2029, and conceived again, reveal the occurrence of distinct pregnancies, with each subsequent conception occurring after a birth. Genesis 29:32. And Leah conceived, and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, Surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction, now therefore my husband will love me. Genesis 29:33. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, Because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he hath therefore given me this son also, and she called his name Simeon. Genesis 29:34. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, Now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons, therefore was his name called Levi. Genesis 29:35. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and she said, Now will I praise the Lord, therefore she called his name Judah, and left bearing. The Bible uses the word bear, H 3205, to indicate a childbirth. There are 2 instances in the Bible's account of the births of Jacob's children where 2 children are bare unto their mother, without the Bible recording 2 distinct conceptions. Genesis 39. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. Genesis 30:10. And Zilpah Leah's maid bare Jacob a son. Genesis 30:11. And Leah said, A troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. Genesis 30:12. And Zilpah Leah's maid bare Jacob a second son. Genesis 30:13. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed, and she called his name Asher. In the births of Gad and Asher, there is no record of a conception, followed by a birth, or a second conception, followed by a second birth. Only that a son was bare, and a second son was bare. Therefore, it is likely that Gad and Asher were twins. Additionally, we find this language concerning additional births. Genesis 30:19. And Leah conceived again, and bare Jacob the 6th son. Genesis 30:20. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry, now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons, and she called his name Zebulun. Genesis 30:21. And afterwards she bare a daughter, and called her name Dinah. In the births of Zebulun and Dinah, there is a record of 1 conception, followed by 2 births. Leah conceived and bare a son, and afterwards bare a daughter. Therefore, it is also likely that Zebulun and Dinah were twins. This is how it would look for Jacob to father all 12 children within 7 years. In year 1, Leah gives birth to Reuben. The biblical terminology is conceived. Reuben is a single birth. In year 2, Leah gives birth to Simeon. The biblical terminology is conceived again. Simeon is a single birth. In year 3, Leah gives birth to Levi. The biblical terminology is conceived again. Levi is a single birth. In year 4, Leah gives birth to Judah. The biblical terminology is conceived again. Judah is a single birth. God opened Leah's womb because he saw that she was hated. Genesis 29:31. This fertility caused her to rapidly become pregnant with each of her first 4 sons. It is likely that they were all born in the first 4 years of the second 7-year contract. On the other hand, Rachel was barren during this period. Genesis 29:31. She gave Bilhah to Jacob in order to have children by her. Genesis 33. This likely would have been done during the same time period that Leah was bearing her first 4 sons, but could have occurred any of the first 6 years of the second 7-year contract. Between year 1 and 5, Bilhah gives birth to Dan. The biblical terminology is conceived. Dan is a single birth. Between year 2 and 6, Bilhah gives birth to Naphtali. The biblical terminology is conceived again. Naphtali is a single birth. Leah had a history of rapidly becoming pregnant with each of her first 4 sons. After son number 4, she discovered she did not immediately become pregnant again, and gave Zilpah to Jacob in order to have children by her. Genesis 39. Zilpah would bear a set of twins. In year 5, Zilpah gives birth to Gad. The biblical terminology is bear a son. Gad is a twin birth. In year 5, Zilpah gives birth to Asher. The biblical terminology is bear a second son. Asher is a twin birth. Leah had not become barren. She only delayed in becoming pregnant again. Genesis 39. It is likely that she became pregnant again not long after Zilpah bore twins. She correlates the birthing of her 5th son with giving her maiden to her husband. Genesis 30:18. In year 6, Leah gives birth to Issachar. The biblical terminology is conceived. Issachar is a single birth. In year 7, Leah gives birth to Zebulun. The biblical terminology is conceived again. Bear son. Zebulun is a twin birth. In year 7, Leah gives birth to Dinah. The biblical terminology is afterwards bear a daughter. Dinah is a twin birth. Leah gave birth to a 5th son, and the following year a twin son and daughter. God then opened Rachel's womb in the 7th year of the second 7-year contract. In year 7, Rachel gives birth to Joseph. The biblical terminology is conceived. Joseph is a single birth. Thus, we see that there is biblical evidence which establishes that it is possible for Jacob to father 12 children to 4 wives in 7 years, which likely included fathering 2 sets of twins. Mr. Camping makes the following assertion on page 50.
If Jacob's time in Haran was 20 years, the events that occurred in Genesis 38, regarding Judah's family are well nigh impossible. Chapter 38. Records events that lead up to the birth of twin sons to Judah, by his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Genesis 46:11. Indicates these sons of Judah, Perez, and Zerah, went into Egypt with Jacob. On the presumption of a 20-year Haran sojourn, Jacob could not have been less than 88, or 89, when Judah was born. Since Jacob was 130, when he entered into Egypt, Judah could not have been older than 31, or 32, years when he entered into Egypt. During this 31 or 32 years, Judah would have had to grow from a baby to manhood, and additionally, all of the events of Genesis 38 would need to have taken place. These events are as follows. 1. Judah married a Canaanite woman called the daughter of Shua. She gave him 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Grew up and married Tamar. Died without seed. It could have been soon after marriage. Onan was slain by God because he refused to marry Tamar upon Er's death. 2. Judah promised his youngest son, Shelah, to Tamar as a husband, but she had to wait until he grew up. 3. Shelah grew up but was not given to Tamar. 4. Tamar, rebuffed at Judah's broken promise concerning Shelah, enticed Judah to commit adultery with her. Twin sons, Pharez and Zerah, were born from this union. These sons, together with Shelah, entered Egypt with Judah.
Mr. Camping makes the following assertion on page 50.
All of these events could not have taken place within that period of 42 years, unless Judah and his son had both married as young as 12 to 14 years of age, but this is completely improbable and has no scriptural validation.
Although Mr. Camping says there is no scriptural validation that Judah and his son married young, there is reason to believe that, though generally rare in practice, this did occur in the case of Judah, and also his brother Asher, and their sons. We find in Genesis 46, the names of those who went into Egypt. Of all the sons of Jacob, only Judah and Asher are listed as having both sons and grandsons enter into Egypt. Including his 3 older brothers, no other brother except Asher had grandchildren at the time they entered into Egypt. Apparently, it was particular to Judah and Asher to marry at a young age, and their sons followed suit. So, although it does appear to be outside the norm, both Judah and Asher did bear sons at a young enough age, that they were grandparents, upon entrance into Egypt. Thus, we see that the events of Judah's life are consistent with his father Jacob's 20-year sojourn in Haran. Mr. Camping makes an assertion on page 51, that the Bible offers an alternative to a 20-year sojourn in Haran. He explains.
Genesis 29:18-30 clearly indicates that Jacob worked the first 14 years, as payment for Rachel and Leah. Genesis 30:25-32 indicates that following Joseph's birth, Jacob made a contract with Laban to work, in return for keeping as his own, spotted and speckled sheep. Genesis 31:41 summarizes his work for Rachel and Leah, and indicates that he worked for a period of 6 years for his flocks. Genesis 31:41 Thus have I been 20 years in thy house, I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Since Jacob left Haran immediately after he had obtained his flocks, the only time during his Haran sojourn, which could have added to the 20 years named in Genesis 31:41, would be the time between his contract to obtain Rachel and Leah, and his contract to obtain his flocks. In other words, he must have worked for wages of some kind, for a period of time, following the expiration of his second 7-year agreement to obtain Rachel. During this wage-earning period, his family continued to grow, until Joseph was born. Then he wished to leave, but was induced to stay in Haran, in return for obtaining as his own all the oddly marked sheep. How long was this wage-earning period? The only clue the Bible offers is the notice of Genesis 31:38-39. Genesis 31:38 This 20 years have I been with thee, thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. Genesis 31:39 That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it, of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day, or stolen by night. Since 20 years is also named here as a time span, some would conclude this is the identical period named in verse 41, of the same chapter. But this cannot be, for as we have seen, we must assume his total stay was more than 20 years.
Mr. Camping says that we must assume that the 20-year period spoken of by Jacob in Genesis 31:38 is a different 20-year period than the one spoken of in Genesis 31:41. His assumption is based on the notion that Jacob must have been in Haran longer than a span of 20 years, in order to have fathered 12 children before leaving. As seen previously, this is not the case. We have also resolved the matter of Judah marrying young, which is consistent with a 20-year Haran sojourn. Let us now begin to examine the 2 20-year periods spoken of by Jacob. In doing so, we will review the events that transpired during Jacob's time in Haran. We begin with the conclusion of Jacob's time in Haran as detailed in Genesis 30 and 31. Genesis 31:3 And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers, and to thy kindred. And I will be with thee. It is the Lord God who instructs Jacob to end his service to Laban. This marks the completion of Jacob's time in Haran, immediately following a 6-year period, during which Jacob has been shepherding Laban's flock, in exchange for wages. Jacob's wages are those offspring of the flock, which are oddly marked in color. We know from other verses, Genesis 30:43, Genesis 31:1-2, that God caused Jacob to prosper greatly during these last 6 years. Genesis 30:43. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and menservants, and camels, and asses. God had blessed Jacob with substantial wealth, during this period of service to Laban. The terms of this contract had been that he would shepherd Laban's flock, and any offspring that would be produced which were oddly marked, would belong to Jacob. God caused it to be, that after each breeding, the majority of offspring that were produced, were oddly marked. And thus Jacob claimed them for his flocks. In this way, Jacob's cattle increased greatly in number, Genesis 30:31-43. Because it's a topic of considerable record in the Bible, let us take this opportunity to review how Jacob's flock came to increase vastly in number, such that at the end of 6 years Jacob's flock greatly outnumbered Laban's. This deal begins when Laban asks Jacob to remain on in his position as shepherd, and tells Jacob that if he does so, he can name his wages, Genesis 30:28. Jacob accepts this offer and determines that his wages shall not be any that Laban shall give to him, Genesis 30:31. Instead, he proposes a specific breeding arrangement in which he will take possession of a particular offspring, that will arise from Laban's flock. Under this agreement, Jacob removes from Laban's flock, any sheep or goat that is not solidly colored white or brown. These animals are taken out of the flock and turned over to Laban's sons, to be kept at a distance from Jacob's future flock, so they do not mix. The cattle which remain, are all solidly colored. Jacob's job is to shepherd this pure flock of Laban's, and his wages are any speckled, spotted, or striped offspring produced by breeding. Normally, like begets like, and therefore it would be less common for solid-colored cattle to produce spotted offspring. Laban is aware of this and thus eagerly accepts Jacob's terms. Jacob is also aware of this, but he has faith that the blessing of God is upon him, and that God will continue to prosper his labor as he had done previously, Genesis 30:39. With each successive breeding, God does bless Jacob. Jacob's breeding methods are reaffirmed by God in a dream, in which God reveals that he has caused the phenomenon of oddly marked births predominating. This oddly marked flock grows with each birthing period, and Jacob's selection process produces strong and robust specimens. Because he possesses such large flocks, Jacob is able to sell many of his cattle at a good price, and buy servants, camels, and asses, that will be of service to him on his trip home. Because oddly marked cattle predominate, Laban sees his flock diminish, while Jacob's grows exponentially. Jacob's flock eventually outnumbers Laban's, which results in envy and animosity, forming within Laban and his sons, toward Jacob. Genesis 31:1. And he heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's. And of that which was our father's, hath he gotten all this glory. Genesis 31:2. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and, behold, it was not toward him as before. Upon realizing the ill will towards him, Jacob speaks with his wives Rachel and Leah, about this soured sentiment toward him, and how their father had been unscrupulous in his business dealings. He declares that because of Laban's dishonest transactions, God has stripped Laban of his cattle, and given them to him. Genesis 31:1-9. The sheep, in Mesopotamia, bear offspring twice a year. In 5 years, Laban would have set new terms with Jacob, a total of 10 times. After a birthing period, where speckled cattle predominated, Laban would change the next term, to render unto Jacob, those which were striped. Then, upon that birthing period, the striped would predominate, and Laban would change the next season's terms, to spotted, and on it went. This was not the original agreement, in which Jacob was to keep all of the oddly marked cattle. And in addition to breaking this agreement, Laban repeatedly changed the terms, in an attempt to prevent Jacob's flock from increasing. He would not have changed the terms at all, the first year, believing himself to benefit from the arrangement. Thus, Laban changed Jacob's wages 10 times in 6 years. While talking to his wives, Jacob reveals that God told him in a dream to leave Haran and return to his own land. Rachel and Leah consent to leave Haran. Jacob then gathers his family, his cattle, and all his goods he has gotten in Haran, and heads for Canaan. He does not inform Laban of his departure. Because Laban is away, it takes him over a week to pursue and catch up with Jacob in Mount Gilead. Genesis 31:11-13, 17-21, 22-25. When Laban reaches him, there is a confrontation. Laban accuses Jacob of carrying Rachel and Leah away, like captives. Genesis 31:26. Jacob reveals the reason for his actions. Genesis 31:31. And Jacob answered, and said to Laban, because I was afraid. For I said, peradventure, thou wouldest take, by force, thy daughters from me. Thus we learn, that Jacob is afraid, that Laban will forcibly take away his wives. Although he had honored 2 7-year service contracts, to legally obtain them, Jacob is distrustful of Laban, as Laban has a history of dealing with him deceitfully. During this encounter, Laban also alleges Jacob has stolen his God. Genesis 31:30, which is an astounding allegation. It is the occurrence of these events, which lead up to the following disclosure, recorded in the Bible. Genesis 31:36. And Jacob was wroth, and chode with Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, What is my trespass? What is my sin, that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? Jacob's anger is kindled. He quarrels with Laban, in righteous indignation, at Laban's ill-treatment, and unfounded accusation. In this setting, Jacob now tells Laban to his face, what he had earlier told to Rachel and Leah. How deceitful, and unfair, his business practices have been during Jacob's tenure of service. Genesis 31:38. This 20 years have I been with thee, thy ewes, and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock, have I not eaten. It is at this time, under this circumstance, that Jacob mentions a period of 20 years. This is the period of time Jacob has been in service to Laban. He has spent these years working as a shepherd. Jacob has maintained a healthy flock for Laban, which has borne healthy offspring. He has not taken for his own food any of Laban's flock. Genesis 31:39. That which was torn of beasts, I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day, or stolen by night. Jacob has been honest in all of his work, despite Laban's harsh and unjust dealings. Genesis 31:40. Thus I was, in the day, the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from mine eyes. Justifiably angered by Laban's denigration, Jacob gives an account of the harsh conditions he has been obligated to work under. Despite this substandard arrangement, Jacob has worked honorably and tirelessly. Genesis 31:41. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house, I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Jacob has now stated twice, that he has been with Laban for 20 years. He has stated this fact, and repeated it for emphasis. The second time he mentions the 20 years, he breaks it down into the business arrangements he has honored within that time. We know that Jacob joined Laban's household when he first arrived in Haran. Genesis 29:14. And Laban said to him, Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month. This arrangement was extended, when both parties agreed upon a 7-year contract for Rachel. Genesis 29:19. And Laban said, It is better that I give her to thee, than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. From the context, it is evident that Jacob has been in Laban's household the entirety of his time in Haran. Jacob continues his complaints against Laban, by recounting that he served 14 years, for Laban's 2 daughters. This was not the term initially agreed upon. Laban had compelled Jacob to accept his terms, which required his working an additional 7 years, beyond the time he had originally agreed. Not only this, but Jacob had not intended to marry Leah. But Laban had cunningly imposed her upon him. Jacob then goes on to speak about the terms that have existed during the 6-year period in which he has worked for wages. Jacob protests that during this period, Laban has changed his wages 10 times. He repeats verbatim this complaint, which he had made earlier to his wives. Genesis 31:7. Laban has been so unscrupulous in his dealings with Jacob, that Jacob knows Laban will not honor his business agreements without God's intervention. Laban would have stripped him of his wives, and his flocks, and all his possessions that he had worked for. Laban has afflicted and troubled Jacob. And God has seen it, and rebuked Laban. Genesis 31:42. Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac, had been with me, surely thou hadst sent me away now, empty. God hath seen mine affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight. Thus we see that the relationship between Jacob and Laban was very tense, upon the completion of the final 6 years of Jacob's service. The Bible records that Jacob was wroth, and that he chode with Laban. If Jacob had spent 40 years with Laban, we would expect it to be recorded by the Bible during this exchange. However, the Bible does not record, make reference to, or imply, that Jacob was with Laban for a period of 40 years. Conversely, the Bible specifically records the fact that Jacob was with Laban for a period of 20 years. Let us review the contracts between Jacob and Laban recorded by the Bible. There are 3 business agreements that the Bible reports, beginning at the time Jacob first arrives in Haran. Genesis 29:18. And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve thee 7 years, for Rachel thy younger daughter. Genesis 29:20. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. And they seemed unto him but a few days, for the love he had to her. The Bible records the terms of this first contract, and the fact that this contract has been fulfilled. The second contract occurs when Jacob discovers that instead of Rachel, he has been given Leah to wife. His father-in-law Laban then requires him to work an additional 7 years for Rachel. Genesis 29:27. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me, yet 7 other years. Genesis 29:28. And Jacob did so, and fulfilled her week. And he gave him Rachel his daughter, to wife also. Genesis 29:30. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him, yet 7 other years. Again, in this second contract, the Bible records the terms of the contract, and the fact that the contract has been fulfilled. The first 2 contracts account for the passage of 14 years in Haran. The first 7-year term was Jacob's idea. Genesis 29:15 and 18, and those years seemed unto him but a few days. Genesis 29:30. It was much longer, however, than his mother Rebekah had originally bid him, when she sent him to Laban's house, for a few days. Genesis 27:44. However, Jacob loved Rachel so, he invested considerable labor into obtaining her as his wife. At the end of the first 7 years, Jacob is eager to wed his bride. Genesis 29:21. Laban holds a feast that evening, and instead of Rachel, he sneakily brings Leah to Jacob instead. Unknowingly, Jacob consummates his marriage to Leah, believing her to be Rachel. Genesis 21:25. Laban devises a new contract, in which Jacob must work an additional 7 years, to pay for Rachel's hand in marriage. This demonstrates the cunning, and deceptive measures, Laban employs in his dealings with Jacob. Despite Laban's trickery, God has blessed Jacob, in these 14 years. He has blessed him with 4 wives, which were part of God's divine plan, to multiply Abraham's seed. God multiplies this seed greatly, causing Jacob to father 11 sons, and 1 daughter, during the second 7-year period. The Bible records that at the completion of this 14-year period, Jacob requests of Laban, to take his leave and return home. Genesis 30:25. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go unto mine own place, and to my country. Genesis 30:26. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go. For thou knowest my service, which I have done thee. Jacob presents to Laban, the fact that he has completed his service for his wives. He is now desirous of returning home. The Bible reports that this discussion occurs, when Rachel had borne Joseph. Genesis 30:25. This matches a pattern, already repeated in the Bible's documentation, of contractual details between Jacob and Laban, and their completion. It also correlates with Joseph being born in the final year of Jacob's second 7-year contract, as we have seen previously. It is at this time that a third and final service contract is made between Jacob and Laban. The Bible specifies the reason that Jacob agrees to this additional contract, which involves him staying on in his position as shepherd of Laban's flocks, despite having previously sought to depart Haran. This reason is that Laban now proposes to Jacob an opportunity to earn wages. This is Jacob's first occasion to earn wages, as in the prior 14 years, he had labored for his wife Rachel. Laban wants Jacob to continue shepherding his flock, because he knows that his flock only increased, because of God's blessing upon Jacob. Laban wants to continue to benefit from this arrangement, and is therefore willing to pay Jacob, to remain in his position. Genesis 30:27. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry. For I have learned by experience, that the Lord hath blessed me, for thy sake. Genesis 30:28. And he said, Appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. Jacob then declares his terms, and Laban agrees to them. Genesis 30:32. I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. And of such shall be my hire. Genesis 30:34. And Laban said, Behold, I would it might be according to thy word. This is the third and final contract of service that the Bible records between Jacob and Laban. The Bible reveals that this contract has been fulfilled, because God instructs Jacob to return home. Genesis 31:3. And Jacob reports to Laban, the completion of 6 years working for his flocks. Genesis 31:41. Each of these 3 service agreements are mentioned by Jacob in Genesis 31:41. These 3 contracts account for exactly 20 years of Jacob's time in Haran. There is no biblical record of a 4th contract between Jacob and Laban that would account for an additional 20 years. Let us more closely examine the two references made by Jacob to 20 years, when he was quarreling with Laban, by comparing three different Bible translations of Jacob's statements. We shall consult the Interlinear Bible, by J. Patrick Green Sr., Young's Literal Translation, and the King James Version of the Holy Bible. Genesis 31:38. Interlinear Bible. Now 20 years I was with you. Young's Literal Translation. These 20 years I am with thee. The King James Version. This 20 years have I been with thee. The verbs do not appear in the biblical text. They are implied. We can see that this verse is a straightforward introduction, in which Jacob states the length of time he has been with Laban. Genesis 31:41. Interlinear Bible. Now 20 years in your house, I have served 14 years for 2 of your daughters, and 6 years for your flocks, and you have changed my wages 10 times. Young's Literal Translation. This is, to me 20 years in thy house. I have served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy flock. And thou changest my hire 10 times. The King James Version. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Here, Jacob restates the fact that he has been with Laban for 20 years. He then accounts for how those 20 years were spent. 14 were spent working for his wives, and 6 were spent working for his oddly marked flocks. Both verses 38 and 41, by context, are referring to the same period of 20 years. The Bible discloses that Jacob is angry when he is confronting Laban, and as such, is presenting a laundry list of dissatisfactions he has experienced during his time spent working for Laban. The biblical timeline of history requires this period of time, spoken of by Jacob, to be 40 years. However, Jacob does not say that he has spent 40 years with Laban. Mr. Camping explains on pages 51 and 52 that these are 2 different, 20-year periods.
The language of verse 39, where the Bible indicates that Jacob had to pay for animals stolen or killed by beasts, and of verse 38, which implies he had to pay for any animals killed for his own food. These conditions may have been a part of his contract with Laban when he acquired Rachel and Leah, but the Bible gives no indication of this. These are not the kind of conditions that one would expect, as part of a contract, for a man's daughter. They would be too petty, and would tend to demean the value of the daughters. On the other hand, they would be very logical clauses in a contract, in which money is paid for services rendered. The phrase, "Thou hast changed my wages 10 times," in verse 41, clearly has reference to the last 6 years, when Jacob received his flocks. See Genesis 31:7 and 8, and therefore, does not relate to any other time except this 6-year period. These 6 years follow the 20 years, recorded in Genesis 31:38 and 39. Therefore, we must conclude that the 20 years of Genesis 31:38 were in addition to the 20 years of Genesis 31:41, making a total of 40 years in all.
Mr. Camping states that Laban's demands were too petty to not be included as part of a contractual agreement with Jacob. He submits the notion that this would be beneath Laban, and would demean the value of his daughters. But we have already seen in Genesis 31, that Laban has dealt underhandedly with Jacob, and the Bible says that God was a witness to his wrongdoings. Genesis 31:12. And he said, Lift up now thine eyes, and see, all the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled. For I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. Laban's own daughters, said this about him. Genesis 31:15. Are we not counted of him, strangers? For he hath sold us, and hath quite devoured also our money. These verses do not support Mr. Camping's idea that the complaints raised by Jacob are beneath Laban, and therefore are instead clauses in a fourth, previously unnamed contract, in which Jacob labors an additional 20 years. We will elaborate more on this momentarily, but first let us bring up a matter of some peculiarity. While Mr. Camping says that verse 38 denotes a separate 20-year period than the 20 equals 14 plus 6 time summary mentioned in verse 41, Chris McCann, of Ebible Fellowship, in his Genesis 30 series, sees it another way. Chris McCann states, concerning Genesis 30:41.
The 20 years is a separate period of time from the 14 years and the 6 years, for a total of 40 years.
Chris McCann concludes that verse 41 is Jacob declaring that he has been 20 years in Laban's physical house, working in some undisclosed capacity, which Jacob lists first, followed by Jacob listing his 14-year and 6-year service contracts. Genesis 31:41. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house, I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Chris explains.
First, he worked 7 years for a wife. Then when his wage was changed, when Laban gave him the older daughter, then he worked another 7 years. Following that, there was 20 years of service in Laban's house, whatever that entailed. And then he wanted to go. So there would be a final contract worked out between him and his father-in-law Laban for 6 more years, a total of 40 years.
Both Camping and McCann each select different verses. Mr. Camping, verses 38 and 39, and Chris McCann, verse 41, which they claim to be the Bible's record of a unique and otherwise undisclosed 20-year period of service, which they then add to 14 plus 6 equals 20 years. 20 plus 14 plus 6 equals 40. The Bible does not report additional periods of service by Jacob of any duration. There is no record of any further terms agreed upon, nor upon the completion of any additional terms. There is no description of any job duty other than shepherding. In fact, the Bible discloses the fact that Jacob's job has been a shepherd his entire life. The Bible makes this report in the following verse. Genesis 46:34. That ye shall say, Thy servant's trade hath been about cattle, from our youth, even until now, both we, and also our fathers. That ye may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. Therefore, there is no other job that Jacob would have entered into. Jacob worked as a shepherd for the entire time he was in Haran. The fact that 20 years is mentioned twice must not be grounds to add the two together. On page 52, Mr. Camping determines that 40 years is the amount of time that Jacob was in Haran. After making this determination, Mr. Camping still needs more information concerning Levi's age in order to arrive at the time bridge. He asserts,
returning to Levi, we remember that he could not have been less than 4 years, Joseph's senior, but with this added 20-year period, he may have been as many as 24 years his senior. The Bible does appear to indicate that Joseph was probably closer to 24 years younger than Levi, than to 4 years younger. According to Genesis 29:31-35, Leah bore 4 children, without ceasing to bear. Thus Levi, the third child, could well have been born in the 3rd year after Jacob's marriage, or the 10th year after Jacob arrived in Haran. If his birth was not in the 3rd year, it was probably very close to it. Joseph, on the other hand, was born in the year just prior to the last 6 years. Genesis 30:25, or at most a few years earlier than the last 6 years. The book of Maccabees is not inspired by God and is not a part of the Bible. But it does give some historical information. In the book of Maccabees, 7:27, it suggests a child was weaned at the age of 3 years. In 2 Chronicles 31:16, we read that the age of 3 was the minimum age for males to enter the house of the Lord for service. In 1 Samuel 1:22-24, we read that Hannah brought young Samuel to the house of the Lord immediately following his weaning. Thus, by relating those two passages, we receive the impression that weaning took place at the age of 3, indicating the reliability of the Maccabees account on this point. Therefore, it is possible, and indeed quite probable, that Joseph was weaned at 3 years. Jacob was then ready to leave Haran. It was at this time that he began his last 6 years with Laban.
Mr. Camping introduces the idea that Jacob would not have been ready to leave Haran until Joseph was weaned. This idea, however, is not based on any biblical information concerning Joseph. Genesis 30 relates Joseph's birth, not Joseph's weaning, with Jacob's request to leave. Genesis 30:23. And she conceived, and bare a son. And said, God hath taken away my reproach. Genesis 30:24. And she called his name Joseph, and said, The Lord shall add to me another son. Genesis 30:25. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go unto mine own place, and to my country. In verse 26, Jacob declares to Laban that he has fulfilled the service agreement for his wives. It reads, Give me my wives, and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go. For thou knowest my service which I have done thee. Jacob tells Laban that he has fulfilled the terms of service for his wives, and now he wishes to take his leave. According to Camping and McCann, Jacob is making reference to the completion of a contract, which occurred all of 20 years in the past. Also, according to Camping and McCann, Jacob would have had in his pocket 20 years' worth of wages. Had this been the case, we would expect that Jacob would be able to provide financially for his own family, as is his duty, 1 Timothy 5:8. But he is, to his own admission, unable to do so. We learn in Genesis 30:30, that at this time, Jacob is not in a position of providing for his own family. Genesis 30:30. For it was little, which thou hadst before I came, and it is now increased unto a multitude. And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now, when shall I provide for mine own house also? If Jacob had worked 20 years for wages by this time, we would expect God's hand of blessing to have been on Jacob. We would expect that Jacob would have already amassed finances. But we find that instead, Jacob immediately leaps at the opportunity to work for wages at this time. This is because none of his prior years of labor had included 20 years of working for wages in some undisclosed capacity, which is what Camping and McCann teach. But instead, Jacob had worked solely as a shepherd, and all of his work had been in exchange for his wives. Hosea 12:12. And Jacob fled into the country of Syria, and Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he kept sheep. Additionally, in strong contrast to Camping and McCann's version of events, because Laban's flock benefited so greatly from Jacob's care, it is inconceivable that Laban would have wanted to remove him from this position, and put him to work in some other capacity, for a length of 20 years. This would be inconsistent with the Bible record. As we have seen previously, the Bible reports that Jacob worked as a shepherd his entire life. The Bible discloses that under Jacob's shepherding, Laban's cattle increased in number, from little to a multitude, Genesis 30:30. There is no record of Laban receiving increase in any area other than concerning his flocks, or of Jacob receiving any wages, other than his oddly marked flocks. Despite these facts from the Bible, Camping's and McCann's teaching of a 40-year stay in Haran would result in the following report of the events in Genesis 30. Jacob works 7 years for Rachel. After 7 years, he is deceived and underhandedly coerced by Laban into working another 7 years for Rachel. During these 14 years, he is shepherding Laban's flock, and is the reason it grows greatly in size. After fulfilling 14 years of work as a shepherd, in exchange for his wives, Jacob remains in Haran, no longer working with cattle, but instead working in an undisclosed capacity, for 20 years, for Laban. 17 years into this 20-year period, Joseph is born. Jacob continues to work another 3 years, in this undisclosed capacity, as he waits for Joseph to be weaned. The assumption is made that Joseph cannot leave until he is weaned, and that he is weaned at the age of 3, because there is a story in the non-biblical book of Maccabees that a child was weaned at this age. After Joseph is weaned, Jacob is ready to leave Haran, and speaks with Laban about the matter. Laban doesn't want Jacob to go, as he is the reason Laban's flocks had increased 20 long years prior. Laban now decides he wishes to have Jacob back shepherding his flock, instead of the undisclosed work he had been doing the prior 20 years. He asks Jacob to once again shepherd his flock, and Jacob agrees to do so. He agrees to do this in order to be able to provide for his family. Camping and McCann believe that apparently, although he has just spent 20 long years of his life working for wages, he has nothing to show for it. Jacob is currently in need of the wages, and therefore works 6 final years, in order to receive flocks of his own. For the first time, with the income from selling the cattle he acquires over the 6 years, he is in a position to purchase servants, camels, and asses, which will be used in his trip home. It is not likely that this series of events occurred. More importantly, there is no record in the Bible of their occurrence. Mr. Camping summarizes on page 53.
We must conclude that the period between the births of Levi and Joseph could not have been more than 24 years. Moreover, it seems likely that this period could not have been less than a few years short of 24 years. A 21-year age differential between Levi and Joseph is most probable. This is the result of assuming that Levi was born in the 10th year, after Jacob arrived in Haran, and that Joseph was born 9 years before Jacob left Haran, at the age of 91. Since he lived in Haran for 40 years, he would have arrived there when he was 60 years old, 31 years before Joseph's birth. This conclusion establishes the following sequence of events. Jacob arrives in Haran at the age of 60. He works 7 years for Rachel and is then married to Rachel and Leah. He is then 67. Reuben is born to Leah the following year when Jacob is 68. Simeon is born next to Leah when Jacob is 69. Levi is born next to Leah when Jacob is 70. Jacob finishes his second 7-year contract for Leah when he is 74. He works for wages for 20 years. In the 17th year of this period, Joseph is born. Jacob is 91. At the end of this 20-year period Joseph is weaned, and Jacob wishes to leave Haran. He is 94. He works 6 years longer for his flocks and leaves Haran at age 100.
Mr. Camping concludes.
We see that all the biblical conditions are met, if we consider that Levi was 21 years older than Joseph. While the Bible does not give exact information that points to a 21-year age differential between Levi and Joseph, we know that it cannot be more than 2 or 3 years in error.
Mr. Camping's idea that Levi was 21 years older than Joseph is not based on biblical evidence, but on what he admits to be an assumption. We have seen previously how this idea is not supported by Bible record, context, or inference. Let us take Mr. Camping's assumption one step further. If, as he claims, Levi was 21 years older than Joseph, then upon their departure, Levi would be 30 years old, Reuben 32, Simeon 31, and Judah 29 years old. We would expect the events in the biblical record to bear out a different narrative. One which incorporates the existence of numerous adult sons in Jacob's household. The Bible informs us that men of Israel became of age at age 20. At this age, they were deemed ready to go to war. Numbers 1:3. From 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel. Thou and Aaron shall number them by their armies. 2 Chronicles 25:5. Moreover Amaziah gathered Judah together, and made them captains over thousands, and captains over hundreds, according to the houses of their fathers, throughout all Judah and Benjamin, and he numbered them, from 20 years old, and above, and found them, 300,000 choice men, able to go forth to war, that could handle spear and shield. We also find that God targeted those aged 20 years and older, when he exacted judgment upon Israel, in the wilderness. Numbers 14:29. Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness. And all that were numbered of you, according to your whole number, from 20 years old, and upward, which have murmured against me. Numbers 32:11. Surely none of the men that came up out of Egypt, from 20 years old, and upward, shall see the land, which I sware unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me. The Bible shows that at the age of 20, men of Israel were counted as mature adults. At least 4 sons of Jacob would be well above this age, if not the majority, upon leaving Haran, based on Camping's and McCann's teaching. Under this premise, let us return to the Bible's narrative of events in Haran. Genesis 31:4. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock. Here the Bible records it is Jacob who is in the field with his flock. We know that he labored very intensely as a shepherd, Genesis 31:40. There is no Bible record of Jacob's sons being with the flock at any time during Jacob's stay in Haran. However, the Bible does report, later, sometime following their departure from Haran, of Jacob's sons tending the flock. Genesis 34:5. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field. And Jacob held his peace until they were come. Genesis 37:12. And his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. As we learned earlier, the sons of Jacob had been shepherds from their youth. Genesis 46:34. That ye shall say, Thy servant's trade hath been about cattle from our youth, even until now, both we, and also our fathers. We know from the Bible that Joseph was out feeding the flock with his brothers, at age 17, in Canaan. Genesis 37:2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Therefore, we would expect that if Jacob had several adult sons, during his stay in Haran, they would have been tending the flocks. However, the Bible does not report this. We shall similarly apply this exercise to the events recorded in Genesis 33. Jacob and his family have left Haran, and Jacob encounters Esau. Jacob has divided his children into groups, behind their mothers. Each mother and her children then come near to Esau and bow down before him. Genesis 33:2, 6-7. Jacob then says to Esau, Genesis 33:13. And he said unto him, My Lord knoweth, that the children are tender, and the flocks and herds with young, are with me. And if men should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. Genesis 33:14. Let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant. And I will lead on softly, according as the cattle that goeth before me, and the children, be able to endure, until I come unto my Lord unto Seir. In verses 13 and 14, Jacob says plainly to Esau, that his group is vulnerable, both his children, and his animals. The children are tender, and they are not able to endure harsh and demanding travel conditions. Jacob has the expectation, that Esau will readily observe, that the children, are at risk of harm. This is consistent with Esau, beholding a group of young children, but it is illogical if he is looking at a group, of mostly grown men, and also possibly teenagers. According to the teaching of Camping and McCann, Jacob's children would be approximately the following ages, upon departure from Haran. Reuben 32. Simeon 31. Levi 30. Judah 29. Dan, between 11 and 31. Naphtali, between 10 and 30. Gad, between 14 and 28. Asher, between 13 and 27. Issachar, between 12 and 26. Zebulun, between 11 and 25. Dinah, between 10 and 24. Joseph 9. It is almost impossible to conclude, that sons of this age, would not have been working the flocks in Haran, or that Esau would take a look at them, and deem them to be too delicate, for travel conditions. However, if all of Jacob's children are born in his second 7 years in Haran, after which time Jacob asks to leave Haran, and ends up leaving 6 years later, the approximate ages of the children are: Reuben 12. Simeon 11. Levi 10. Judah 9. Dan, between 8 and 11. Naphtali, between 7 and 10. Gad 8. Asher 8. Issachar 7. Zebulun 6. Dinah 6. Joseph 6. Children ranging in ages, from 6 to 12 years old, is consistent with the Bible's narrative. Mr. Camping has concluded on page 54, that Levi must have been 21 years older than Joseph. He declares,
One other piece of evidence points precisely to the 21-year age differential, and also shows how time was reckoned during the Egyptian sojourn.
He says evidence points to the 21-year age differential. He will refer to this evidence as the perfect tally. On page 55 he applies a hypothesis that he had outlined prior in his book regarding what he refers to as reference patriarchs. Mr. Camping had stated earlier in Adam when, that the genealogies in Genesis were a record of father-son relationships unless the Hebrew word, called his name, Karashem, was used, or it was very clear from the details given that there was a father-son relationship. He refers to Exodus 6:16-20, in which the Bible lists the names of the sons of Levi, and their death ages. Levi died at 137 years of age, Kohath died at 133 years, and Amram died at 137 years. Also in verse 20, the Bible records the birth of Aaron. Mr. Camping goes on to state,
Since we know Levi lived 77 years in Egypt, if our 21-year assumption is correct, and since the Bible indicates that Aaron was 83 years old at the time of the Exodus, Exodus 7:7, all of the ingredients are available to establish the chronological sequence during the Egyptian sojourn. Remember that the death year of one patriarch coincides with the birth year of the next, thus, the results must look like this. Levi's time in Egypt: 137-60. 77 years. Kohath's period of patriarchal leadership: 133 years. Amram's period of patriarchal leadership: 137 years. Aaron's age at the time of the Exodus, Exodus 7:7. 83 years. Total: 430 years. This sum tallies with Israel's sojourn in the land of Egypt, which we read was 430 years in Exodus 12:40-41. Exodus 12:40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel, who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. Exodus 12:41. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt.
Mr. Camping now incorporates his prior assumptions and makes the following determination.
Thus, we see that our assumption is correct, that in certain situations, there existed a patriarchal calendar, with one patriarch living his entire lifetime, as the family head. God indicates to us that the generation or patriarchal period of Kohath followed the period of Levi, and commenced in the year that ended Levi's period. Similarly, Amram's generation followed Kohath's. Aaron's generation began at the death of Amram. In this way the Bible gives us a time bridge, covering the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt that is identical with the 430 years of Exodus 12:40.
Mr. Camping believes that, because his perfect tally has resulted in the sum of 430 years, that this constitutes proof that his assumption is true. Mr. Camping continues.
It could be argued that this genealogical proof is based upon the assumption that Levi was 21 years older than Joseph, and, therefore is not necessarily valid. Yet if we look at the alternatives, we can see the validity of this assumption.
After declaring his assumption to be verified, Mr. Camping is now prepared to present his biblical timeline of history. Using the 430-year period which began when Jacob entered Egypt, and which ended the year Aaron was 83 years old, combined with the genealogies of Genesis 5, and the genealogies of Genesis 11, which he believes to be a list of reference patriarchs, the assigning of dates is set to begin. However, the Bible itself does not provide any dates, nor does it contain the archaeological or astronomical information that can be used to determine a date. In order to create his calendar, Mr. Camping goes to information which is outside of the Bible, which he uses to create the first date on his timeline. Mr. Camping does not downplay this step. He states clearly on page 59.
To establish this genealogical table, we must begin with a date that has been positively identified, through non-biblical sources, such as archaeological and astronomical evidence. Only in this way, can we relate the biblical record to our modern calendar.
In plain terms, Mr. Camping makes it known that he is going outside of the Bible. He cannot use the Bible itself to determine an initial date, as God has not included any dates in the Bible. Without this information, the biblical timeline of history cannot be constructed. It is interesting to note that Mr. Camping says he requires a date that has been positively identified through non-biblical sources. A question that arises, is how would one deem ancient pagan archaeological information, that is obtained outside of the Bible, as being a true record? It is perplexing why Mr. Camping believes artifacts and ancient astronomical records can be deemed to be sources of truth, upon which to build his biblical timeline. However, this is exactly what he does. Mr. Camping expresses that he owes his timeline creation to one man in particular.
We are particularly indebted to the eminent scholar, Edwin R. Thiele, who in his book, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, establishes the date of the death of Solomon, and the division of the kingdom, as 931 BC, since Solomon reigned 40 years, 1 Kings 11:42, and began building the temple in the 4th year of his reign, 1 Kings 6:1. The building began in the year 967 BC.
Due to the fact that in the creation of his timeline, Mr. Camping has to go outside of the Bible for information, he cites his reference source, a book by Edwin Thiele. Thiele's work in determining the year 931 BC, his materials, methods, conclusions, are taken as 100% truth by Mr. Camping, and serve as the foundation for his timeline. Mr. Camping attributes to them a weight of validity equal to that of the Bible. Thiele's research involved the study of ancient clay tablets from Assyria, known as Limya lists. Lists of royal Assyrian officers. Where the Assyrian scribe describes the occurrence of an astronomical event, which in modern opinion is presumed to be an eclipse, and it is recorded as occurring during a particular ruler's reign, the attempt was made to identify the year that this event took place. This was done by consulting the writings of ancient Roman astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, in his book Almagest. After examining Ptolemy's writings, there would then be speculation as to what year that eclipse may have occurred. Mr. Camping has not analyzed these pagan records himself, but Edwin Thiele has written a book, and Mr. Camping uses Thiele's date of 931 BC, to start off his timeline.
Division of the kingdom at the death of Solomon 931.
It should now be mentioned, that in future books and pamphlets, that contain his biblical timeline of history, Mr. Camping does not disclose his dependence upon Edwin Thiele's research, in the formulation of dates. In his book 1994, for example, this fact is omitted entirely, and replaced by a simple sentence.
If our modern calendar is used, we would learn, for example, that the division of the nation of Israel into two kingdoms upon the death of Solomon occurred in the year 931 BC.
What is not disclosed by this statement is, that this date has been determined by man, and is not infallible. What is also not stated, is that God in fact warns, in His holy word, against going outside of the Bible, and taking that, which originates from man, and adding it to His holy word. It is impossible for God to forbid this action, and yet also require this action in order to come to truth. Additionally, Chris McCann, of Ebible Fellowship, does not disclose the fact that Mr. Camping obtained the date 931 BC from Thiele. When answering a question he received, in which there was doubt concerning the validity of the biblical timeline, in light of the fact that there are no absolute dates in the Bible, McCann does not make known the truth of this matter. He instead uses the date 931 BC, as proof that Mr. Camping's calendar is correct. McCann provided the following reply to this question in May of 2021.
We can look at Solomon's death age as a calendar tie-in. According to archaeologists, Solomon died in the year 931 BC, some say 930 BC. As a matter of fact, the date of 931 BC, for Solomon's death age is so widely known you can Google it, and it is the first date that appears. Well, when does the biblical calendar of history say Solomon died? The biblical calendar, that comes all the way down from creation of the world, 11,013 BC. To the flood, 4990 BC. To Exodus from Egypt, 1447 BC. To the reign of King David, 1007 BC. And to the reign of Solomon, reveals that Solomon reigned, from 971 to 931 BC, then he died. It's an exact match. Chris McCann.
McCann in his answer, presents a series of dates as proof of the harmonizing of biblical and secular sources. The biblical calendar cannot be wrong, if in going from the year of creation, to the flood, to the Exodus, to the death of Solomon, the year 931 BC is arrived at, which is the same date reported in secular records, he proposes. However, Chris does not reveal that Mr. Camping required the secular date first, and then he moved backwards, and assigned earlier dates. Thus the question as original query, about the validity of a biblical calendar, when the Bible gives no dates, is not given a truthful answer. The truthful answer, if Chris were to divulge it, would be something like this. There are no dates in the Bible, and therefore a secular date had to be used. Mr. Camping originally admitted to obtaining this date from a book by Edwin Thiele, but later began to downplay that fact as more and more doctrines were being taught that were dependent upon the biblical timeline's accuracy, even to the very day. because no secular source can be deemed equivalent to biblical truth. And because God specifically warned against going outside of the Bible for truth. If this fact is clearly stated, the repercussions would be the invalidation of almost every doctrine that this ministry has taught over the many years. Chris McCann, at one time, openly spoke of Mr. Camping utilizing secular sources in the formation of his timeline. Let us now listen to a portion of a Bible study taught by Chris McCann in 2012, in which he declares that it is biblical to use secular evidence to solve the Bible's mysteries.
With the 70 weeks of Daniel 9. Remember the commandment, Mr. Camping wrote the booklet, 70 weeks of Daniel 9, and he looked to secular evidence to date a particular king's reign in order for the commandment, I think, to Ezra. And what locked it in, even though he went to a secular reference to get the date for that particular king, and yet we understand that's biblical because all the other information fits so perfectly, fits so precisely, that it couldn't be anything else but the solution to Daniel chapter 9.
The Bible is absolute truth. Secular information is not absolute truth. Never should secular information be added to the word of truth. God's word stands alone, and is circumscribed by the Bible, and the Bible alone. A biblical timeline of history is the creation of men. Harold Camping, Edwin Taylor, ancient Assyrians, Ptolemy, and others. Mr. Camping openly disclosed this fact in the 70s, in his book Adam When. In conclusion, there are several components of Mr. Camping's biblical timeline of history which can be evaluated, and which render it invalid and erroneous. In our study, we have focused on the key element, as identified by Mr. Camping, which is the age of Levi when he entered Egypt. Mr. Camping's timeline requires this age to be 60, in order for his 430-year tally to be accurate. As such, Joseph would have to have been born when Levi was 21 years old, and accordingly Jacob would have to have been in Haran for 40 years. While all of these premises Mr. Camping originally admits to be assumptions, he then determines them to be factual because the tally adds up to 430. This is circular logic. It is clear that the time Jacob spent in Haran is the length of time that was required for him to receive the blessings God bestowed upon him: wives, children, and wealth. When God had provided these things to Jacob, he instructed him to leave Haran. Therefore, the duration of Jacob's stay in Haran was equal to the length of his contractual agreements with Laban. The Bible details 3 contracts between Jacob and Laban. In all 3 Jacob works to shepherd Laban's flock. Jacob worked as a shepherd his entire life. The Bible records the terms of these contracts and the fulfillment of these contracts. There is no record that any other contractual arrangement was entered upon by Jacob and Laban. There is no record of a 40-year stay in Haran. It is not consistent with the Bible's narrative and is instead contrary to the Bible record. In conclusion, we have endeavored to prove from the Bible that Jacob spent 20 years in Haran. As we have done such, Mr. Camping's biblical timeline of history is shown to be untrue, and every doctrine which has been derived from the timeline is entirely unsound. Second Timothy 4:3. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. But after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. Verse 4. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. May God in His wisdom and mercy, use this video, to instruct those who have been deceived, by the many false teachings, associated with the biblical timeline of history.